Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I want to express my gratitude to Susan Siegel, Natalio Grinman, and the other members of the Council of the Americas, as well as to the Chamber of Commerce and Services for inviting me to speak today. I'm a bit agitated with the back and forth, but the issue of management. In such difficult times as the one we've just experienced, generates a very strong team spirit. It's truly incredible because the rest of the world is talking about the Argentine miracle, and without the colossi I have as ministers, this would be impossible. So, my gratitude to all my ministers. I also take this opportunity to greet the speakers on the various panels that took place today, as well as the members of the National Cabinet who came to defend our administration, and also, why not, the governors who support and are part of the spirit of the times that came to change Argentina. I am pleased that more and more of us are putting aside pettiness and differences to agree on the fundamental pillars of this change, which we institutionalized with the signing of the May Pact on July 9 in Tucumán. I want to begin by reviewing the current situation, 9 months into our administration. Economic developments in Argentina and the world are so dynamic that it is sometimes easy to lose sight of the broader picture and underestimate all the progress we have made in management. In other words, it is common in both economics and politics that the forest is sometimes hidden from the trees. Therefore, I am here to tell you, firsthand, about the path we have already taken and the one we still have to travel. This administration has had to face the worst inherited crisis, both economic and political, in Argentina's history. Specifically, at the time I took office, we were experiencing the worst of Argentina's 3 worst crises. We had a monetary imbalance that was at least double that of the crisis before the Rodrigazo in 1975. We had a bankrupt central bank, even worse than in 1989, before Alfonsin's hyperinflation. And social indicators were worse than they had been in 2001. In other words, it was the sum of all evils. It was a real hot potato. In that sense, we faced this challenge with great courage, with great bravery, because we took on a country on the brink of default and hyperinflation, with twin deficits of 17 percentage points of GDP. We had the Sierra debt of nearly $50 billion. We had debt, in pesos, soon maturing for the equivalent of $90 billion, and we had external debt, due for $25 billion. Furthermore, we had, at the central bank, the equivalent of 4 monetary bases maturing in one day. We had the issue of the puts hidden, among other things. And in that context, evidently, the government, which left, expected us to resolve matters, not as libertarian liberals, but rather as libertarian liberals, in such a way that the combined stock and flow problems would result in tremendous hyperinflation, and in January, we could return. But with all the adjustments made by the market in the worst possible way and with the consequences that I will now, in a moment, describe, if we hadn't implemented the program we did. In other words, it was clearly premeditated so that we would blow up in less than a month. Added to all this were delayed tariffs and other important prices in the economy, equivalent to a fifth of their value. At the same time, the central bank had negative net reserves of $11 billion, meaning we were poised to head straight into the worst crisis in our history. That would have left us with annual hyperinflation of around 17,000%, a GDP contraction of more than 15 percentage points, an unemployment rate that would have reached 30%. And, as has happened in other similar experiences, the number of poor people would surely have reached 90% and the number of destitute people 50%. In other words, we would have had a true catastrophe. But all this did not prevent us from addressing the problem and beginning the reconstruction of the country, mandated by the citizens, through the ballot box. This is how we achieved the largest fiscal adjustment in human history. To give you an idea of the adjustment, we found a consolidated deficit of 15 points of GDP. 5 in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. Naturally, they told us that making an adjustment in the Treasury of 1 point per year was enormous. Therefore, I believe that the mildest words they've told us about wanting to achieve a zero deficit in the first year of government would have at least gotten us called crazy. And in that regard, thanks to Minister Caputo's tremendous management, we have achieved a financial surplus, that is, the much vaunted zero deficit, truly, in the first month of his administration. If you consider that, in the last 123 years of history, we had a deficit in 113, you'll realize what an enormous achievement it is, and when we didn't have a deficit, it was because we weren't paying the debt. It's the first time in history, from the beginning of the 20th century until today, that we have achieved a positive financial result without being in default. On the other hand, there was the issue of the quasi-fiscal deficit, which was 10 points of GDP. Naturally, no one talked about that issue, a topic too sophisticated for the general public. But it was a bombshell that, indeed, had to be resolved. And there, in conjunction with Minister Caputo, Central Bank President Santiago Basili, and with the enormous work of Pablo Corneau, the Finance Secretariat, in 6 months, it seems incredible, but in 6 months, we managed to close and liquidate the quasi-fiscal deficit, consolidating a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of GDP in 6 months. The largest fiscal adjustment in human history. We ended Treasury financing through monetary issuance. We lowered the interest rate and, progressively, began to clean up the central bank's balance sheet. Since we began Phase 2 of our program, there is no longer any monetary issuance tap in the Argentine Republic. We have closed them all. And it is thanks to this that the exchange rate situation has stabilized. Basically, our working hypothesis is that inflation is always, and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon. To end this scourge, we must end the issuance of money, because this increase in the quantity of money is what leads to the loss of the purchasing power of money, and that causes all prices, expressed in monetary units, to rise. The exchange rate is just another factor. We must understand that. The exchange rate is just another price in the economy. And what the central bank does with the quantity of money is determine the nominal scale of the economy. There's something going on. Thank you. So, in that context, the first stage was zero deficit, precisely to cut off issuance to finance the fiscal deficit. It was achieved in the first month of my administration. Not only that, but we had to end what was causing the quasi-fiscal deficit and end the interest-bearing liabilities. Once we ended the interest-bearing liabilities, we also ended the issue of the puts. And in that sense, we had moved toward a zero excess money supply program. That is, the only way money was going to be issued was through the external sector, that is, through the purchase of dollars. Assimilating the sale of dollars by the private sector as the counterpart to the demand for money. That is, with dollars, you buy pesos. But one of the things we realized is that this wasn't enough. Because, in reality, until we finish resolving the stock problems, we have currency controls. And in that situation, it's not that individuals are buying pesos with dollars. But rather they are liquidating dollars because the currency controls are in place. Therefore, it's not true that there is genuine demand for money, and from that point on, we moved to a zero-emission system, while we have currency controls as a consequence of not yet fully resolving the stock problems. This is interesting because, maliciously and/or out of ignorance, they talk about intervention, that we were intervening in the foreign exchange market. What would a world or equilibrium be like without intervention? In the non-intervention equilibrium, the interest rate must be free because it's an intertemporal coordination mechanism. And we shouldn't touch it. The exchange rate would be free, and therefore, the change in reserves would be zero, and the change in the money supply would be zero. In this case, since we have capital controls due to a problem of stock imbalances, which is increasingly smaller, in this sense, the only way to replicate the non-intervention equilibrium is, precisely, to remove the pesos we issued by purchasing dollars from the currency controls. Obviously, since there was a gap for every $3 traded in the MULC, two have to return and one remains within the central bank, and the change in the money supply is zero. Therefore, if you look closely, this new equilibrium has a lower degree of intervention than we had before. Therefore, it's not that we went to a level of more intervention, but rather less intervention. That's why I, sometimes, don't know if economists, after so many years of living in a dirigiste economy, have gone completely haywire or are just plain stupid. Obviously, with the fixed amount of money, with the nominal scale remaining fixed, what started to happen? The exchange rate began to fall, and the convergence between the parallel and official exchange rates is happening from the top down. Not as it has historically been in Argentina, from the bottom up. In other words, we're not willing to devalue to ruin Argentines. We're going to work on changing productivity levels so that Argentines don't have to be impoverished by the misdeeds of poor quality economists and by governments of the worst kind. Still, we're still bearing the brunt of the real blow that was the emission of 13 points of GDP last year. But thanks to the fiscal and monetary anchor, we managed to avoid hyperinflation. And we're bringing it down. In fact, I always like to work on the topic of wholesale inflation because it anticipates inflation, and when we arrived in December, wholesale inflation was 54% monthly. I understand that economists, as they predicted all kinds of calamities, don't want to see it that way because their mistakes will be exposed. But 54% monthly annualized is the equivalent of 17,000%. And the reality is that the latest wholesale data was 2.7%, that is, annualized, that equals 35%. Wow, isn't it a tremendous achievement, worthy of historic recognition for Minister Caputo? Going from 17,000% to 35%. But I have more to recognize for Minister Caputo, yet there's more to come. Now, 2.7%, but I also have a crawling peg system. That is to say, in a sense, we are enabling that inflation floor of 2, obviously, because we have to resolve an entire inventory problem. And in that context, if we remove that floor of 2, inflation would then be traveling at less than 0.7 per month. That is, inflation hasn't truly dropped from 17,000 to 35, but rather from 17,000 to 8%. Thanks, Toto. And the truth is that we are doing all of this through market mechanisms, and not through the economic shamanism to which politicians have accustomed us. The essential characteristic of this anti-inflationary program, compared to successful historical ones, is that, for example, one of the things that didn't happen beforehand was hyperinflation, which would have led to a liquidation of the economy's financial assets and which would have been very easy to stabilize because, starting from very low levels of monetary aggregates, it becomes very easy to stabilize through the restructuring of the demand for money. For example, but that equilibrium seemed very painful to us, had the orcs allowed us to continue governing with hyperinflation. On the other hand, we also did it without expropriations. In other words, there was no such thing here, as many econochanists predicted, about a Buenos plan, not to mention the imbeciles who talked about there being a Buenos plan when there wasn't. On the other hand, another distinctive element of this, there were no price controls. Not only were there no price controls, but neither was the exchange rate controlled. When, in reality, with an economy with the instability of the demand for money that it has, and the flexibility we have to switch portfolios to dollars, fixing the exchange rate makes stabilization much easier. And as if all this weren't enough, we are carrying out this entire stabilization process by resetting relative prices. It's interesting. Everyone sees the miracle, except Argentines. But we're not just focused on issues related to short-term stabilization, if you will. With an aggressive fiscal and monetary design and adjusting the external sector until stocks are restored. We've also addressed the long term, as we have undertaken a reform plan that is the most ambitious in Argentine history. The reform program, the largest in Argentine history, was implemented in the 1990s. During Carlos Menem's administration, the reform we implemented with the DNU and the ley bases base law is 8 times larger than what Menem achieved during his entire administration. And we did that in 6 months, with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and 10% of the Senate. Tell me about management now. Furthermore, our economic program has many facets and battle lines, but it rests on 3 major foundations: an organized macroeconomy without traps or shortcuts. To provide a definitive solution to the problem of inflation, a deep cut in public spending to ease the burden on the private sector, and an obsessive focus on deregulation and restoring freedom to every Argentine, where I have the privilege, the honor, the pride of having a minister of intellectual stature, a colossus, like Federico Sturzenegger, leading this revolution. I'm a fan of my ministers, you see, because some idiot said I surround myself with mediocre people to show off. But what can you expect from the analogical red circle? But there they are, continuing to predict that Massa would win and all that. In that sense, to achieve the first, we have made a non-negotiable commitment to fiscal balance. The economy has clear rules. The first is that you cannot spend more than you earn. That's it. That's enough. It's over. There's nothing more to say. In fact, when we turned our backs on him and started squandering what wasn't there, not only did we do terribly, but those who lost the most were those who had the least. Who paid the price with the inflationary tax? From the beginning of the 20th century until today, according to the Cerro-Maloni methodology, Argentina has had 22 crises. Of those 22, 20 were fiscally motivated. That's all there is to it. And that's why I also want to give you a preview of what we're going to do regarding the budget. We're going to redesign the way the budget is written. The budget is a set of expenditures, an estimate of revenue is made, and from that, the primary result is derived. The interest is charged. The financial result is derived, and from that, the financing is derived. We decided not to use that methodology. Our methodology will be called zero deficit. And zero deficit implies that the financial result is zero. Therefore, I don't need to be taking on new debt. That is, Argentina stops taking on new debt. Note that rolling the debt isn't new debt because, afterward, the types appear that add up with difficulty and can't even be done with an abacus. They say, oh, they took on debt. Yes, I say, to roll the debt. Note because we live in Argentina. Not only that, once you go to zero deficit, that means the debt to GDP ratio is not increasing. Therefore, looking ahead, we would have to see the country risk plummet. And this is interesting because while there was a financial shock around the world, what was the only place that rose and fared better? Argentina. But not only that, because that means that, then, the primary surplus will equal interest. And as stated, in terms of a zero deficit, the budget can be made revenue neutral. So, there will be a portion of public spending that will be adjusted, for example, following inflation. And the remaining public spending will be allocated by difference, consistent with that rule. Thus, for a baseline scenario, certain items are determined, which will later be weighted. And that is what will allow, as revenues are adjusted, given spending with that logic, those items will be allocated by difference. Thus, a rule is designed to not violate, in any way, the zero deficit. We will not have a fiscal deficit. Moreover, regarding inflation, the truth is that, in the last 15 years, there were only 2 countries in the region that had annual inflation of 20%. And we all know which ones. One was us. The other was the bloody dictatorship of the criminal Nicolás Maduro. I want to be very clear about this. Inflation nullifies any kind of life plan, business plan, or even starting a family. It's impossible to calculate expenses or plan for a dignified future with inflation eating into the pockets of Argentines. Therefore, ending it is instrumental in regaining the confidence of all economic stakeholders, which was squandered by previous governments. It's from these past experiences that we learned that organizing the fiscal and financial spheres is a sine qua non for returning to growth. No matter how good a government's intentions may be, without a sustainable macroeconomic framework, everything else is ephemeral. It doesn't go from the micro to the macro. You organize the microeconomic framework, and the macroeconomic framework is a disaster. You're going to end badly. That's why, first, you have to organize the macroeconomic framework. First, you have to end and exterminate inflation. Why? For the price system to begin transmitting information correctly and for resources to be allocated efficiently, there is no other mechanism. And that's why we make fiscal balance a commandment, one that transcends any change in management and will remain for posterity. Regarding the deregulation plan, which affects every sector of the economy, the empirical evidence is on our side because, as you've heard me say many times, the freest countries are 12 times richer than the most repressed ones. Aside from the fact that they have 50 times fewer poor people in the extreme format and 25 times fewer, if we take the standard one. But this implies fighting, among other things, against the particular interests of the business class, the interests of the union class, and especially against the interests of the political class. Which is the one that protects those sectoral interests, something that Minister Sturzenegger ingeniously calls the Bermuda Triangle, because at the apex between those elements, the entire country disappears. Everything we are doing is already yielding results. In July alone, registration rates rose by 19%, auto production by 48%, retail sales by 40%, construction by 12%. And real estate activity by 36%. When you start looking at the activity map, or the traffic light, if you will, the green color is getting increasingly clear. And, technically, the recession reached its worst point between April and May. Let's go back to the statements we made at that time, saying, the worst is over, and, naturally, the eco-chantists said, the worst is yet to come, who are the same ones who predicted that inflation, for example, wouldn't be able to break below 7, and now we're seeing if it goes below 4. In retail, but here we are. Part of these pillars becoming a reality is possible thanks to the joint work carried out by the technical teams, led by the Ministers of Economy and Deregulation, Toto and Federico, who since taking office have carried out what can only be described as a heroic feat that will undoubtedly go down in history. We are serious. We want to leave behind the failed model of the current state and re-establish the model of freedom. That is why we are making a profound, root and branch change, and all profound change requires time. A scarce commodity that must be used prudently and wisely if we want this new model to be sustained over time. The people cannot wait any longer, but they understand that this is the only way forward. Politics must understand the same and support, with their own efforts, the citizens' efforts. There is no point in making changes that cannot last. We have already experienced that history. With governments that fail after rushing to provide solutions that later cannot be sustained, creating worse damage than what was initially present. We are not willing to repeat that history. Therefore, believe me, I tell you later that no one is as eager as I am to get out of the trap. But, as I've said before, removing the patches without first solving the underlying problem would worsen the crisis we inherited. This reminds me of what Milton Friedman said about inflation and alcoholism. In both cases, when alcoholics start drinking or when countries start printing money, the good effects come first. The bad effects come later. When the cure arrives, it's the opposite. They start with the bad, and then the good comes. And the hangover from quitting drinking, the more you drink, the deeper the hangover. Imagine, with the 20 years of populism we've been through, it was clear it wasn't going to be a bed of roses. That's why I ask you to see the whole story and not just the snapshot. We don't care about pressure, no matter where it comes from, because we didn't come here to engage in demagoguery. We came here to change things, seriously, and for good. As we clean up the central bank, we can lift the exchange restrictions. And that will generate greater investment and expansion of economic activity, which, by the way, are factors that drive economic growth. It's false that growth isn't possible while the currency controls are in place. That's also a fallacy, and I'll explain why. First, there are elements that are driving the rebound. I don't consider it growth, but many look at the GDP rate and talk about growth with that. But there are factors that contribute to the rebound, to the recovery. And there are factors that will contribute to growth in the long term. As for the rebound, what you're going to have is the following. There's a restructuring of real wages. There's compensation for pensions in real terms. Therefore, what this will allow is for demand to begin to expand, in a context of high idle installed capacity. Therefore, that is one part of the rebound. And you can constantly see how wages and pensions are beating inflation. The other issue is the inventory cycle. Towards the end of the previous administration, as the crisis was looming, many companies stockpiled what they did to cover themselves. This meant that activity, during the latter part of the previous administration, did not fall as much as it should have. And that exacerbated the decline we experienced during the first part of this year. Therefore, the rebuilding of inventory, that will also generate a rebound. I also want to mention quantitative issues because with the Planeta plan, and the expansions and everything, in the last quarter of last year, the economy fell 2.5%, and we, with the largest adjustment in human history, fell 2.6%. They want to take it year over year to show the worst, 5.1. When the fiscal adjustment was made in 2002, not of this magnitude. But much smaller, the drop was 16%. Therefore, this also implies that the adjustment was carried out intelligently and took into account the protection of the most vulnerable. But not only that, but also that growth is generated by investment, and investment must be financed, and it is financed by savings. The fiscal adjustment of 15 points of GDP returns money to the private sector. That's why, while in December we were discussing hyperinflation, today we're discussing 30-year mortgage loans. That is, this burden of the state, by shifting it out of the way, is returning funds to the private sector so they can invest and we can grow. Of course, I'm not going to tell you who has to invest. I'm not a communist, I'm not a socialist. I believe in the market. You have to do it. Go ahead, do it. Obviously, as we reduce public spending and make the surplus we worked so hard to achieve more sustainable, do you know what we're going to do? We're going to lower taxes. That is, when there are surplus resources, we're going to lower taxes. Something we're already doing, and, basically, a reflection. What is the true burden of a country's tax burden? Milton Friedman and Murray Newton Rothbard were very clear about this. It's the size of the public sector. And if we made a 15-point GDP adjustment, we're the government that has returned the most resources to all Argentines, like never before in history. Therefore, those who are focusing on whether some taxes temporarily increased, and that we're the first case where we're demonstrating that it was temporary because we're lowering them, also returned 15 points of GDP to the Argentine people. Look at this, how interesting. Because today we have a zero deficit, but in a context that's coming out of a recession. In other words, that, in terms of structural results, is positive. It means that when the economy rebounds, we'll reinstate taxes, and when the economy also starts to grow, we'll reinstate more taxes. In other words, I'm going to take it upon myself, personally, to take the boot off the neck of the entire private sector so that we can return to genuine growth, because wealth is created by the private sector, not by parasites in the public sector. Obviously, if we're not doing this at the speed we'd like, it's because the conditions aren't right yet. And rushing to take this step puts at risk everything we've achieved so far. This isn't a minor issue. It's much easier to do it on paper than to implement it. Especially when, on the other side, the orcs are. So, of course, because it seems like a joke. Besides, I'm going to tell you something. This is what Pablo always says, brilliantly. He says, he does it with the case of the currency controls. Well, we have to open up, we have to do this, we have to do that. Now, if we did that and they took us down, we'd end up with a brutal crisis. And when the brutal crisis comes, the person who was comfortably writing these things from a desk grabs the table and says, "One thing, why shouldn't this have been done?" Do you realize? I mean, all they do is change what they wrote on paper. In the meantime, they can take down a government. So what we're going to do is respect the timelines and conditions of our economic program. The same one we proposed to society and the same one they supported with their vote. If you notice, we don't set goals and timelines. What we do is, we meet goals, and as we meet the goals, we take steps and move forward. So, what's the anxiety? Lifting the currency controls, that is, phase 3? Well, when will that happen? When we have definitively cut off monetary issuance. That will occur when the monetary base, in the conventional format, finally equals the broad monetary base, which means that all the excess money has been eliminated. The flip side of that is that you'll see that the inflation rate will be very similar or tending towards zero, which means that, when that happens, there will be no excess pesos. If there are no excess pesos, I can clearly open the door, because it's like giving them a shotgun without bullets. No matter how much they want to shoot, they can't because they won't have any bullets, and since we are taking out all the pesos and since, from now on, we will also take out close to 8 trillion pesos. I can assure you that what this economy will be short on are pesos, and when that happens, because that's when everyone goes on alert and has fits of despair, of course. They've never in their lives lived in a world with a fixed currency. We talk about currency competition or the term endogenous dollarization. I'm going to put it in dollars because it's easier, so I'm not talking about things that might seem very abstract to you. If you had a fixed exchange rate, the increase in demand for money will translate into what you'll use your dollars to buy pesos, and that's what expands the money supply. In that case, the money supply is mapped to the demand for money. But what's happening? You're leaving those dollars inside the central bank's balance sheet. And what's the problem with that? A government of criminals could always appear and raid the central bank's reserves. They're the same idiots who say, no, no. The problem with the new monetary rule is that we don't accumulate reserves now, so we can't pay the debt. First point, what does it mean, then, that countries with a free exchange rate default? The truth is, I have a hard time understanding the level of clumsiness of our professionals. But not only that, let's follow their reasoning. So now we buy dollars from the central bank so the treasury can pay the debt. I mean, excuse me, I'm going to say this in Latin, as Pablo's professor would say. But are you suggesting I kick the Argentines' asses with an inflationary tax to pay the debt? But we're all crazy. Dollars are bought with a fiscal surplus. The Treasury will buy dollars on the foreign exchange market, not by counterfeiting money and defrauding good Argentines. And in that context, the other big fear that arises is, if people are going to have to bring dollars to make transactions, and I have a fixed amount of pesos, I'm going to have a brutal appreciation of the currency. And since I'm going to have a brutal appreciation of the currency, if that happens faster than the speed at which I modify the structure of the economy, that appreciation could create a problem for me. In terms of activity and employment, that's why we talk about currency competition or endogenous dollarization, because when we reach that stage, the two currencies can coexist and transactions can be made in both currencies. In this way, the same supply of dollars that you bring will have a counterpart in demand for dollars, and then the exchange rate will remain stable, and no one has to cry about appreciation. In other words, to gain competitiveness, it will have to be done by investing, not by defrauding people. On the other hand, We have seen again in recent weeks, I just mentioned it, the fragility of the international financial and monetary system. It has become popular among analysts to interpret the view that the world is increasingly moving toward fragmentation rather than integration, more toward discord rather than peace, more toward closure than openness, more toward withdrawal than the search for new markets. I imagine that many of you must have asked yourselves, at some point, how can Argentina prosper in such a turbulent world? How can we move forward when others are falling behind? Well, just as we fell behind before when everyone else was doing well and we weren't doing badly, we can reverse that. At least to do, inaudible. I tell you, do not fear, because we have advantages that are often unseen, but that much of the world lacks, which are anchors that protect us against potential storms. First and foremost, we are purging the Argentine economic system of a decades-old cancer, monetary populism. In Argentina, you're no longer going to throw a rug under the rug from under crises by taking on debt and printing money. We've learned, once and for all, that getting out of the crisis with money printing is useless. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of the rest of the free world, which is increasingly indebted and increasingly diluting the value of its currencies. Therefore, it is no coincidence that, around the world, the purchasing power of ordinary people is increasingly lower, despite ever-increasing corporate valuations. They are playing with fire, taking a medicine that, in the long run, is nothing more than poison. Well, we are not going to be monetary populism, we don't care if others do. We have intellectual honesty and a commitment we have made to society to emerge from the crisis, which we inherited by doing our homework and with genuine growth, not by engaging in economic shamanism, which, in the long run, always breeds poverty, who are the ones who end up paying for it. By doing things right, Argentina can go against the grain of the world and be an oasis of stability in the desert of global populism. Second, 25 years of economic populism, default, breach of contract, and legal unpredictability have left us, an undercapitalized country, with its best companies undervalued and with almost $300 billion of Argentine dollars outside the system. Third, this moment of uncertainty in global finance, which, regardless of the comparative advantages we enjoy as a nation, underscores its value. We have dynamic primary sectors with inexhaustible sources of resources that the world needs and will continue to need, whether in crisis or not. We have the second largest shale oil reserves in the world. We produce food for 500 million people. We have the third largest lithium reserves in the world. Vast reserves of copper, still untapped. Solar, wind, and hydropower, the Guarani Aquifer. And, as if that weren't enough, we have first-class human resources in all professional fields, although I have my doubts about economists, thanks to whom Argentina is no longer a global leader. Despite the tragic political administration of the last century, we do have the worst in the world, otherwise I wouldn't have won. Do you think the same can be said of many other countries? No, only of a handful, so there's no doubt that we've been privileged by God in the global lottery. And fourth, but equally important, we are embarking on a paradigm shift, not only economic, but also social, political, and cultural. And with this change, we are going against the grain of the direction that many countries around the world have been taking recently. While other countries propose censorship, we propose freedom of expression. Just look at what's happening in England. Since the socialists came to power, they're jailing people for posting on social media. Well, journalists here would like it too because they don't like the fact that they've lost their monopoly on the microphone and can use that tool to extort, smear, and slander without any cost. Social media is taking its toll on them, and they don't like it. Stop looking for ghosts. You're getting the same thing you did. But it's just that people are doing it organically because they realized you're criminals, many of them. At the same time, while others are increasingly close to falling into cultural and religious wars, which will end up expelling good people from their countries of origin, we invite the rest of the free world to participate in a country under reconstruction. While others punish those who undertake and produce, we celebrate them, we invite them back to the system. While others sacrifice innovation, creativity, and freedom itself on the altar of false morality, we deregulate the economy and return autonomy to the private sector. We Argentines have already realized that all the do-gooder rhetoric is a scam in the service of oppression. We have already realized that those who pose as champions of morality and defenders of the dispossessed always end up being the perpetrators of the worst atrocities. And boy, is the system creaking. All this, coupled with our geographical distance from war and conflict, can mean a destiny of peace and tranquility for men and women throughout the world fighting for a better life. And it can also mean a place of return for so many Argentines who today try their luck abroad. As Milton Friedman said, the first vote, and the most important of all, is cast with the feet. Choosing where to live. Many used to say, the way out is Ezeiza. We're here to propose that Ezeiza be a gateway. What I mean by all this is that we have the potential for Argentina to be a haven of development, peace, and prosperity for the free world in the coming decades. If the world continues on the path it has followed, from the post-war period onward, the path toward greater commercial and productive integration, we will not only do well, we will do extraordinarily well. But even if the world were to go astray, even if times of difficulty and uncertainty were to fall, we have what it takes for Argentina to stay afloat and succeed where others fail, which would also entail the immense responsibility of being a beacon of light amid so much darkness. An obligation we will never turn our backs on. This is not a question of arrogance or declamatory patriotism. No, it is not. It is about analyzing the objective conditions we have for greatness in this global context in which we have been forced to live. Therefore, when we say that the power of heaven is with us, it is not just a wishful thinking, but the manifestation of a concatenation of facts that suggest that Argentina is facing a change of era. However, turning all this energy into action will require a lot of work from all of us who participate in Argentine political life, at all levels, in national, provincial, and municipal politics, and in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We all have an obligation to live up to what the Argentine people need, which is to take the dead weight of the state off their shoulders, to withdraw the state to make room for a dynamic and thriving society that, for too long, has been tied up. We are doing a great job. We have taken the chainsaw to a level no one conceived possible. We are deregulating economic activity at breakneck speed. It's funny to me because there was an idiot who said it was too much to use in a blender and that only a small pair of scissors remained. It seems that Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and many people abroad see it, but it seems that those here don't. It's strange, they don't see it. But returning to what I was saying regarding what goes beyond the states, beyond the national state, especially the provincial heads of state, we committed, in Tucumán, to the sanctity of private property. We committed to promoting free and deregulated economies free from bureaucratic strangulation. We mustn't be afraid of unleashing private initiative. The only effect it will generate is a boost to economic activity. I ask you to be up to date. Take the example of the rental law. Deregulation sharply increased supply. The increased supply lowered prices in real terms, and better real prices improved access to housing for all. The province is also committed to helping reduce public spending from 40 to 25 points of GDP. I want to be clear, the national adjustment alone is not enough. 44% of our country's state spending corresponds to the provinces and municipalities. For every national government employee, there are 3 provincial employees. So if we want to meet this goal, the contribution of the provinces is essential. The same is true of the RIGI, National Institute of Statistics and Geography. Since it was approved, investment announcement after investment announcement has piled up across the country. Society must know that large investments will not reach provinces that do not adhere to the regime. And politicians who deny reality will have to choose between removing their ideological blinders and supporting change or condemning their own citizens, depriving them of greater activity, more work, and more wealth in their districts. In other words, the path to freedom is, in the long run, a path to reconciling politics with citizens. But ultimately, this requires us all to engage in an exercise, shifting our focus from the short term to the long term, and also shifting our focus from small payments and personal interests to focus on what we call intertemporal general equilibrium. If all of us, not just some, practice the example we preach, and not just some honor the commitments signed in Tucumán, I have no doubt that we will move forward faster than anyone can imagine. Finally, as I bid farewell, I want to once again thank the authorities of the Council of the Americas and the Argentine Chamber of Commerce and Services for the invitation and the warm welcome. I also want to thank all of you present for listening to me. I got a little intense today, I apologize, but spontaneous order is as follows. I decided to open many windows in the speech. And sometimes it happens. And I also want to invite you to join me in this endeavor to make Argentina the most prosperous, free, and thriving country it ever was, so that we may once again be a land of opportunity for all who, as our Constitution says, decide to live on Argentine soil, that place dreamed of by ordinary, working people, plagued by hunger and misery, who came to an Argentina where it was a paradise in which they could rebuild their lives. A refuge of peace and prosperity for those fleeing the constant conflict that is gradually engulfing the world, just as we did 120 or 150 years ago. Put the stamp where you will, but 120 or 150. But it's somewhere around there. Believe me, we can do it, and we will. I am sure that all of you, who are key players in Argentine economic life, will play a fundamental role in this process. May God bless the Argentinians and may the forces of heaven be with us. Long live freedom, damn it. Thank you very much.